If that doesn't scream cheesy as hell horror, I don't know what does. Happy Halloween, everybody, and welcome to my review of Phantasmagoria for PC and Sega Saturn, if you're in Japan anyway. This review is coming to you courtesy of Fusion Bunny. He sent me this, so thank you, it is greatly appreciated. This is a point-and-click adventure game by Sierra that was originally released in August of 1995, and it saw a Sega Saturn release in Japan, which is kind of crazy because the Saturn release actually had 8 discs, whereas the PC one had 7. That was a lot of discs, and back then this was kind of a huge deal because, let's face it, there weren't all that many adult-oriented games out there, and not only was this one an adult-oriented game, but it had some pretty controversial content in it to begin with, and it had Roberta Williams spearheading the whole thing. If that name sounds familiar, she did the King's Quest games. It's quite a huge change of pace from what we associate with Roberta Williams, and the ultimate payoff was that it was a very high-grossing game when it came out, and it was one of those games that was generating a lot of controversy. You had people calling for it to be banned, that sort of thing, which is all kind of funny considering that Sierra very explicitly marketed this thing to adults and adults alone. And this is where you see kind of the big problem with video game perception. Back in the day, in the 90s, video games were seen as toys. They were not seen as something that could be considered an artistic medium, and they were certainly not seen as something that adults would partake in. Now, obviously, now we know much better than that, and video games are pretty much accepted, but you gotta keep in mind the historical context of Phantasmagoria in order to actually be able to understand the whole game. Because without that historical context, this is really just another FMV game in a sea of FMV games that were coming out in the mid-90s. So the question really becomes, what is this thing's place in gaming history, and what does it bring to the table other than controversy and FMVs? Well, as far as presentation goes, you will notice a very immediate comparison between this and Gabriel Knight 2: The Beast Within, if you are familiar with that game. And that is that they basically use the same engine and the same FMV techniques. And it shows, in both good ways and bad ways. Good in that for its time, it was actually one hell of a looker. The artwork was incredibly impressive back in the day, and the FMV itself was also very, very impressive, very high quality stuff. There are problems associated with that, though. The first problem being, this thing came on 7 discs. And you were constantly swapping between them as you went between the chapters. It got pretty ridiculous. And other FMV games of the 90s were that way too. It was a big curse of the genre because those FMVs take up a lot of space. And we didn't have anything other than CDs back then. We didn't have DVDs. Nowadays, you could just put it on a couple of DVDs or even just put it on a single Blu-ray and it'd be fine. But back then, it was them experimenting with the technology that they had available to them, and not really realizing the downsides that came with it until it was a bit too late. This also extends to the actual quality of the FMVs, which, while great for 1995 standards, not so great now, especially if you don't run them in the sort of high-res mode, where if you run it on the lower res mode, not only are they absolutely tiny, but they actually have interlacing, which is those lines that you see in a lot of really, really old FMVs that go across the screen. That was pretty much standard stuff for the 90s, and it looks horrible by today's standards. Luckily, you can improve that, and it is still rather pixelated and not really that high quality video, but you gotta keep in mind when this thing was made. And as far as the actual quality of the FMVs go, they did a decent job with it. I mean, the set work is pretty nice considering that you had these actors on a green screen set and they had very, very limited things to work it with, and all the actual backgrounds and such are all 2D art. But they did a surprisingly good job with the direction, and this is something that extended to Gabriel Knight 2: The Beast Within, and in fact was done a bit better in that game because they had learned from their mistakes in Phantasmagoria. On occasion, you will see them just interacting with things in a really odd manner, and sometimes the artwork doesn't match up to what they're doing, but generally speaking, they did a very good job with what they had, and it's actually one of the few FMV games of the 90s that actually did a good job of integrating the actors with the artwork, at least as best they could. So it deserves kudos for that at the very least. That said, the acting is really cheesy most of the time. It feels like a B-movie at best. And then there's the glory of Crazy Don. This guy just went all out, and it is a beautiful thing to watch sometimes, especially when you get to the later parts of the game, when all sorts of hell is breaking loose. But generally speaking, it's really corny, and even though it does lend some charm to the game for feeling like a B-movie, it's really not very good acting in the long run. So that can actually grate on your nerves after a while if you're not used to that kind of thing and you don't expect it to be cheesy going into it. Although why you wouldn't expect it to be cheesy as hell going into it is completely beyond me, frankly. It's pretty obvious right from the get-go that it's going to be that way. And as far as the rest of the presentation goes, like I said, it's an FMV game, so pretty much everything pertains to the FMVs. The only things that really stand apart from that are the sound effects and the music, with the music being decent. It's meant to be this kind of creepy soundtrack, and on occasion it approaches that, but there's a problem. And it's that the FMVs and just how incredibly cheesy this game is overall make it really hard to actually be scared by this thing. So, where the music can actually be a bit tense sometimes, it ultimately doesn't have the desired effect of creeping the player out just because the FMVs are so incredibly corny. But hey, at least the sound effects are doing their job and not much more, which is really all you can expect out of an adventure game. But ultimately what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, and the story in this is that you play as the novelist Adrienne Delaney, who moves into a mansion with her husband Don Gordon, who's a photographer. And the mansion was owned formerly by a magician named Zoltan Karnavash, or Carno as he was known. And that dates back to the 19th century, so the 1800s basically. And immediately something is wrong because Adrienne has started having horrendous nightmares, which of course Don says is just due to them moving into a new house. But as Adrienne starts exploring the mansion and finding out more and more about this guy Carno, the more it becomes apparent that something is horribly, horribly wrong with this mansion. And let's face it, this story is pretty cliche in a lot of respects, namely the fact that this is an obvious haunted house story, but the haunting doesn't really come into major significance until Adrienne finds a walled-off area in the house, which is a small chapel. And when she's in there, she finds both a book containing the family tree of Carno and a small lockbox that mysteriously opens itself, basically. And that's the clip you saw at the beginning of me talking about this, where some green thing just spews forth from this box and goes off to do some nefarious thing in the house. After that happens, Don starts acting really, really weird. He goes from being a very loving and caring husband who does occasionally get frustrated, but is generally very, very nice to Adrienne, to all of a sudden being very cold and controlling, and eventually it leads to the glorious wonders of Crazy Don, as Don is just unraveling. He's going completely insane eventually. And that's really not much of a spoiler. You can see that coming from a mile away. What you don't really see coming from a mile away is the rape scene. Yeah, there's a rape scene in this game, and as you might expect, it is incredibly uncomfortable to watch. So for those of you out there who might have that as a trigger, then I recommend not playing this game because it will upset you. Even though it is obviously fake, it's still incredibly unsettling and is in fact the most unsettling thing in the entire game. Frankly, they could have done entirely without that scene. It doesn't really go very far other than to show that Dawn has really changed. And that's accomplished through other things, especially the further you get into the game. So I don't want to spoil too much of the plot here, but suffice to say, there is evil in the house. And it's ultimately up to Adrian to escape that evil, preferably by stopping it. And the plot itself isn't particularly great, but if you take it by B-movie standards, it's not that bad. In fact, it feels like a B-movie as you're going through the game. And it definitely takes a few cues from slasher movies, namely with the gore effects. Now, this is something I could have talked about in the presentation, but it really does delve more into the spoiler territory with regards to the story, because eventually you start delving into why the house is the way it is, and that leads to some discoveries about some murders that occurred on the premises of the mansion. And I'll show you a clip of one here. It's actually one of the really tame ones, and it's also the first one you come across, so it's not quite as strong of a spoiler. But even though these effects are fairly cheesy, they are surprisingly effective because they're all practical effects, and it does show in a lot of respects, particularly when you get to the later stages of the game, where they really go all out on the gore effects. And even though they might be pretty brief, they're pretty gruesome, and it actually works in the game's favor. It makes it feel a lot like a slasher flick, and that only enhances the cheese factor. So, if nothing else, you can enjoy this based purely on the way that the effects are set up, the way the plot is set up, and the way it's all acted as a B-movie, as a really corny, really ridiculous kind of slasher B-flick. And on that level, it's not bad. It works out pretty well, in fact. Where it unfortunately doesn't work as well is in the gameplay department, where this is a point-and-click adventure game, but it's really more of an interactive movie. The puzzles aren't particularly challenging. In fact, I don't remember a single one that was actually challenging other than, where do I go, what do I do? And that's not so much the puzzle design itself as the game design. It has a real direction problem. You can spend quite a lot of time just sitting there going, okay, what do I do? Where do I go? What's going on? What's this thing? What's that thing? Because unlike other Sierra adventure games and other adventure games in general, Adrian doesn't really have much of an inner monologue. On occasion, she will say something, but generally speaking, it's up to you to figure out what you're supposed to do with a given item, and even worse, what an item even is. To give you an example, there's one item you can find very, very early in the game that is a small cat figurine. And you just look at that and you go, okay, it's a cat figurine. Well, what do I do with it? Where do I go? What do I do? And the game doesn't really give you much of an indication that you're supposed to actually examine it and then manipulate the object with the examine function until you can find a way to activate it. And it turns out it's a letter opener, and you can use that to open the brick wall, by of course using it to carve through the mortar. But suffice to say, that can be very, very confusing, and it gets really bad when you're on the first day in particular, because it basically just says, okay, explore. Okay, what am I looking for? And so you explore, and you find that pretty much every door is locked, and you're just like, okay, I'll keep exploring, I guess, and I'll interact with these things over and over again, and nothing's going to happen. It eventually starts to become more intuitive later on in the game, and gives you some vague objectives, but it still has that problem of Adrian not really having much of an inner monologue. The game just does a poor job of articulating to the player what they need to do, when they need to do it, and where they need to do it. And that's especially surprising considering that Roberta Williams was spearheading this thing, and that was pretty much what they learned in the Sierra adventure games eventually. Not having a sense of direction is very problematic. And they had learned that before Phantasmagoria, so it's really surprising that this game suffers from that issue. That said, you do get used to it after a while, and if nothing else, you can look up a hint guide. You don't really need one, other than to just give you this sense of direction, to just say, oh, well, I just need to go over here. Okay, well, from there I understand what I need to do. But I can see where if you're trying to do this thing without any sort of hints, which the game actually does have an in-game hint system, well, you can run into issues, and it can be pretty frustrating sometimes. So as far as gameplay is concerned, that's a very significant problem, and it's one you're going to need to overcome if you're going to try to play Phantasmagoria. What you will find here is a serviceable B-movie. It's corny, it's ridiculous, it's kind of exploitative in the gore department, it's controversial for its time, but these days we look back and it's like, that's not really that bad. And the only really standout, really unsettling moment is the rape scene. But if you're looking for something with an incredibly cheesy horror vibe, you're gonna find it in Phantasmagoria. It may not be the groundbreaking titles that were, say, Wing Commander 3 or Under a Killing Moon as far as FMVs go. It may not be anywhere near as good as other Sierra adventure games, but it just has this charm about it that's hard to describe. You really do have to play it yourself and just get wrapped up in the corniness to really understand that. But somehow, despite it all, Phantasmagoria ends up still being a pretty entertaining game. Certainly not the most amazing around or anything like that, but as far as FMV games go, you could do a lot worse. Let's put it that way. I'll have a link in the video description box where you can take a look at this if you're interested. Thanks for watching.